Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Jo Melvin, who's been really the inspiration for many of the processes of thinking that have gone into the academic core of this conference. And she's going to talk a little bit more about the thematics we're hoping to explore over the 2 days. So, Jo. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and I must say how delighted I am to be here and to be engaged with this incredibly diverse and rich territory with so many colleagues across the university, student engagement and levels of interaction which are extremely exciting. Now, rather than talk about the individual sessions that are going to be following the next couple of days, what I'm going to do is to throw in some kind of metastructural and kind of strategic pointers for ways of thinking that underpin much of what we're going to be looking at today and maybe lead on to some further questions. I'd like you to perhaps bear these things in mind during the course of the next couple of days and to continue to think about them after these 2 days have finished. So we're talking about the stuff of matter and the cultural production of meaning, and how the accumulation of value occurs, and who and what validates these premises of value. Now, it might seem strange when we look at these two images side by side to invoke the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard when we look at it, but I'm going to do just that, because on the one hand we have the site of production, the studio, and on the other side, we have the quantifying indexical assessment of the repository of matter, including super-hygienic surgical gloves. No sweat there, no dirt can contaminate the product. Now, Kierkegaard's methodology of strategizing his authorial process by a series of self-effacing, deflective, pseudonymous characters enables a useful paradigm for thinking about our relationship to material, how we inhabit something when we inhabit it through the projection of becoming another, whether we're looking at it from a detached point of view, or where we are in relation to this. And I think it's a useful overarching metastructural strategy for the plurality of differences you're going to encounter here. It's both playful and profound, something to bear in mind when we look at all this matter. Now, in a particular text, Kierkegaard's called Repetition, Kierkegaard's pseudonymous author, Constantin Constantinus, has a dilemma of whether or not it's possible to go beyond recollection, to go beyond the recollection of an event, and to recreate the event through an extended process of repetition. Constantin reflects that repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions, for what is recollected is repeated backwards. Now, this conflation of forwards and backwards as sort of time structures and experiences, this durational thing, is something that is fundamental to our encounter of objects, of archive, and of what we're engaged in today. This notion of the present being conjoined somehow through this same movement in opposite directions of reflection and projection. Now, Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authors enable this distancing from the authorial project via this constant deflection. And it sets up a sort of removal of privilege of one monolithical voice, so we have a multiplicity of voices, destabilizing of the voice. Now, one quite amusing thing, his strategies are often amusing, often frustrating, but one quite amusing thing is, for example, the concluding unscientific postscript to philosophical fragments is this size to the philosophical fragments which are that size. So the idea of the conclusion being huge to a fragment or the exposition of text, which is referred to as a fragment, is both humorous but also subverting our expectations about what a conclusion might be. Hence, what I'm saying is that our expectations can be utterly skewered and subverted by what we encounter in the archive, in special collections, and how we engage with this. So now, to think of this kind of plurality of possibility, and to balance that against the idea of amanuensis, sorry, I can't speak now, I've lost my ability to speak, amanuensis. So this sense of ghosting, a kind of neutrality of where the researcher is in relation to the matter, where the researcher's personality is, where their being is, where their experience is. This idea of non-inflection and self-effacement is one kind of paradigm often associated with the conservation of materials, and where one is in relation to that, where is the ethical position in relation to that responsibility and to that role. Now here we have a book written by George Kubler called The Shape of Time, which was published in 1962, and it's my copy on the left. And Kubler's text opens with a useful statement which really kind of gives us a really good gambit for what we're talking about. He says, let us suppose that the idea of art can be expanded to embrace the whole range of man-made things, including tools and writing, in addition to the useless, beautiful, and poetic things of the world. By this view, the universe of man-made things simply coincides with the history of art. Now, in 1962, it's a pretty radical statement, but it is nonetheless one that continues to resonate today. On this side here, we have a photo of annotated text from Ad Reinhardt's copy of the book. Now, you can take that on face value. It could equally well be my annotated text. And where my voice resides in relation to that, and whether you believe what I said first or what I propose, what I said second, is your call. But it's part of what we're actually looking at and thinking about. Where is where is this authorial project going? What is the truth of this matter, and where are we placed in relation to it? Now, Ad Reinhardt was so impressed with The Shape of Time that he bought numerous copies, and he gave them to all the young artists whose work he was interested in, and he carried it around with him. I'd like to move on to a Reinhardt cartoon, How to Look at Looking. Now, in 1966, Reinhardt published his review of the Kubler text, which he called Art versus History. And that review said, what every artist knows, fine or free, and knows she has to be able to forget, is the whole timeless history of the whole world's art history, East and West, all 10 or 20,000 years of it, art as art, not art as history, or history as art, or art as anything else, or anything else as art. What every artist over or under 50 knows is that there is something wrong with the way art history has been taught and written. What's wrong? What's right? How should art history be taught and written? Backwards, forwards, sideways, all at once. How do time and true art take a single road? How is a false art to be cast out if true art is not to be sidetracked or railroaded on the train of art history? I think this is an extremely useful way for thinking of bringing everything together and allowing a reconfiguration to take place. Now, one of the first monograph of Ad Reinhardt's work was written by Lucy Lippard, who was involved in curatorial projects, in writing, and in all forms of bibliographic compilation of data, material, and so on. Now, in 1992, she wrote this book, The Lure of the Local, which inhabits a retrospective and projective experience of different landscapes. Running through the text is a personal account of her experience of Maine, growing up in Maine, her moving to Maine during the summer holidays, her growing up in New York, her moving to different places, her coming back to Maine through the summer holidays, and sometimes living there. This continues throughout the text. Different places trigger different recollections. Knowledge ensues from pointing to the specificity of place. Combined with this, in the body text, is an experience of inhabiting new landscapes. Landscapes in New Mexico, walking through the terrain, becoming part of the landscape, inhabiting its being, becoming connected to its peoples, its rocks, its geographical, geological, and archaeological parameters. This layering of underlying themes and the hidden and overlooked structures is something that Lippard does exceptionally well. They become like armatures for ideas, whalebones and threads, things that we don't necessarily look at. These complexities of the armatures are what we're attempting to penetrate and expose. Now, another paradigm of compilation and pragmatic thinking comes from this slide we have here, which was the Stichting Igris Foundation website of Seth Sieglau. Seth Sieglau's practices of curation, exhibition management, working with the art world, working with textile collections, working with building textile collections, working with building bibliographic data, working with building libraries, working with various forms of chronological developments and diversity, form a kind of paradigmatic model for what this conference might bring together. It's like a model for this, for these diversities and differences. Now, the header, which I think you might not be able to see there, combines objects with actions. So we have contemporary art, textile research, databases, historic textiles, headdresses, time and causality, and libraries. Then we have the actions involved, the verbs involved with encountering and working within these. We have researching, rethinking, documenting, questioning, collecting, lending, helping, organising, understanding, developing, and donating. Now this conference explores different ways of stimulating interactions between archives and special collections, interventions and various modes of thinking about where we are in relation to these things. Whether we think of the archive as a witness or as a testament, a remembrance of something, whether we mourn its loss or its passing. Now these various relations to it include curating archives as exhibition and publication projects, the digital interface, the analogue, the digital divide, publication and special collections, their recent histories and contemporary practice in artistic intervention and experiential appropriation of the archive as a medium for production. Now this raises a series of questions that we also need to keep in mind. The use and or what we might construe misuse of the artefact or document raises questions of custodianship, conservation, handling and access to handling. Defines the question of what is a good reader or user, depending on the context in which we are operating. Ethics necessarily underlies all aspects of our encounter in the archive and in special collections. I'd like to hand over to the next panel, and I wish you all an enriching 2 days.